Now it's time for RTB 101. This is the segment where we talk about practical questions to help train you to share your faith with friends and family more effectively. And here to help me talk about a very intriguing question: what does the Bible say about the origin of the races? Dr. Fazale Rana, welcome back.
Thanks, Krista.
You know, I think that there's a lot of confusion about what Christians believe on this issue, and many non-Christians who are very confused as well. So I'm glad we're tackling it. Yeah. Let's kind of start at the beginning of what the biblical data is in the early parts of Genesis. What immediately comes to my mind is like Genesis 1, 26 and 27, humans being created in the image of God. Eve, Genesis 3:20, the mother of all living.
Yeah, well, and from my perspective, what these passages are teaching is that all humanity comes from a primordial pair. All humanity bears the image of God and therefore has infinite worth and value before God and hopefully before other people. And it's interesting, even when you have Genesis 5, which is the genealogy going from Adam to Noah, it reminds us that all human beings were made in God's image, and that image of God was passed from Adam to his descendants. And so everybody who is part of the human race is an Adam, and all bear the image of God.
Well, that's a really good starting point for us. And I think even in Acts 17, Paul revisits that issue when he's preaching to the Athenians, saying that all of us came from one man.
Yeah.
And so this seems to be a critical part of what we believe about the origin of the races.
Well, and what's exciting to me is that there's a scientific basis for now to think that this is true. Like looking at mitochondrial DNA as a genetic marker and evaluating the variability of mitochondrial DNA among people groups around the world, it looks as if all humanity traces an origin back to a single ancestral sequence of mitochondrial DNA dubbed mitochondrial Eve that many people believe corresponds to a single female individual. And so it does look like, at least with respect to mitochondrial DNA, that all people come from this mitochondrial Eve.
Well, that's interesting. So there's the scientific foundation of the races coming from at least one woman seems to have some basis in fact.
That's right, yes.
Okay, so now another thing I've heard is that the Bible also talks about the sons of Noah. They come off the ark a few chapters later, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and that all people are descendant from them. But I've even heard some people say that's the origin of the main races. Wondering if you might comment on that.
Well, I'm familiar with that view, but I've just never seen that as referring to the origin of races. I actually think that a better explanation for racial diversity among human beings actually is found after human beings are scattered at the time of the Tower of Babel.
Yeah, it's what's interesting to me about that passage in Noah. It's a more antiquated view, but some people might run into it. So we want them to be aware of that. Yeah. But we don't necessarily see that as being strong biblical warrant for the origin of the races.
That's right, yeah.
So now let's talk about Babel, which is kind of the third passage that I hear put forward, Genesis chapter 11, when God kind of scatters the nations. So let's talk about that.
Now there, in that passage, it tells us that God is confounding the languages, but there's nothing there that actually directly says that racial diversity emerged. But it does tell us that the languages were confounded and that people were forced to scatter around the world.
Okay.
And so arguably the racial diversity of humanity would have originated at that time as a result of humans migrating into different environments, being separated from each other geographically and also in terms of their forming isolated reproductive groups.
So that's an important distinction, because I'm glad you're bringing that to our attention, because I think we read into the Babel account that it's a scattering of the races, but it's really just a confusion of the languages. And the origin of language is sort of a separate question.
There's been a lot of work done scientifically on the origin of racial diversity. And what we've learned is that racial diversity can originate very quickly. through microevolutionary mechanisms, natural selection, sexual selection, and genetic drift. And that in and of itself is sufficient to account for the differences that we see among people in different regions of the world.
Well, that's good, because that was going to kind of lead me to my next question is, we obviously see different physical characteristics depending on where people live. What you're saying is that that's the result of microevolutionary changes when populations are isolated and interbreeding, intermarrying with one another.
Yeah, I mean, most likely the very first humans probably looked like African people groups look today, and that it's the different racial groups emerge again from that African template, if you will.
So Adam and Eve were probably looked a lot more like Africans than they look like us.
That's exactly right, yes. Having light pigmentation is actually an advantage, for example, for people that live in northern latitudes, because there they lack exposure to direct sunlight, which is critical for vitamin D synthesis. So people in northern latitudes need lighter pigmentation to be able to produce the appropriate amount of vitamin D, which is critical for a lot of aspects of our health. People living near the equator having heavily pigmented skin is good because it actually protects folic acid from being destroyed, which again is critical for human health. So that's an example of how microevolutionary changes could account for racial differences. There's nothing fundamentally different about the races other than these superficial differences that give some assist in survivability in certain climates.
Interesting. So science is coming together with the Bible to say that we have one race, if you will, the human race, that these racial differences aren't as big as we might think that they are. And in our worldview as Christians, we really want to advocate for the equality and the dignity and value and worth of all humans.
Right. And to me, the biblical text clearly teaches all human beings are made in God's image and have infinite worth and value. And what's exciting to me is scientifically, we also would reach that same conclusion. We all are in mitochondrial Eve. We all have equal worth and value. And the regional differences that we see, the racial differences, are really superficial. There's no fundamental genetic difference between any human being on the planet.
Very good. I want to encourage you to check out Fuzz's blog, The Cells Design. Just go to reasons.org and search Cells Design.